It's really easy to get started with Power Automate, and much of my content focuses on how very simply you can get started in automating business processes. But ultimately, the value of your flows isn't in the technical knowledge that you have in building a flow, but in taking existing business processes and turning them into something that can be automated. At a basic level in Power Automate, we think about situations where if something is true, then go ahead and do this. But very rarely are the rules that exist around processes in businesses that straightforward. There are lots of steps, lots of caveats that exist in whether something should happen and how it should be dealt with. So in this video, I'm going to look at how do you take more complex business needs and turn them into steps in Power Automate. Specifically, I'm going to look at conditions and switches to look at how you can use those and build them up in such a way to deal with even the most complicated logic outside of your flow in a simple way inside of your flow. So I've created this really simple Excel data source with data that you might see for an expense reporting system. I've got the name of the person who is submitting the expense, the date that they've done so, the previous report date, the value of their report, the department they work in, whether they're authorized and what their role is. And attached to this, I've created a fairly simple Power Automate flow. It's an instant flow that grabs all the rows from that table, initializes a couple of array variables, and then uses an apply to each on each of the rows from the Excel table. I've got some compose actions here which are just designed to tidy up the data that I get from Excel into usable data for Power Automate, and I'll talk about that a little as I get to it. And then a condition where if this condition is true, then I append the row to the variable called table data. And if it isn't true, then I append the row to the table called not table data. And down here, I just create two HTML tables to show what is in each array. So right now I've got this set up to say that if the value of the report is more than 1,000, and I've just taken this through this compose step where I've put the int function around my value that I'm getting from Excel just to make sure that it's a number and not a string. If that is greater than 1,000, then we're going to say yes, add it to my table, and if no, we're going to say no, put it in this table. So let's just show how this works. And here you go. You can see I've got my included rows, which include 3, where you can see the value is greater than 1,000, and my not included rows, I've got a few there where the value is less than 1,000. So you can see basically how this works. So what we're going to do now is go through and look at how some business rules, some policies around expense reporting might be described within your business, and then how do you build conditions here that enable you to represent those rules, those business requirements in Power Automate. So let's look at the first one. Employees may only submit an expense report once authorized by HR upon completion of process onboarding. So looking at our data source, you can see I have this expenses authorized column here, which represents that authorization by HR. And the data here is either a yes or a no. So I need to only authorize those that are a yes. So what I'm going to do is come into this condition, and I just need to make the data on this side of my condition what I'm looking at, and I need to make the value on the right side of my condition what I'm looking for. So what I'm looking at is expenses authorized, and I want that to be equal to yes. And you can see in my no table, I have one entry for Alex because expenses are not authorized for him. And I have all the rest in my yes table because they have expenses authorised. So normally within a business, your rule set is not going to be that straightforward. The business requirements around different policies are going to be more complicated. So let's add to this. So now we're going to say employees may only submit an expense report once authorised by HR upon completion of their process onboarding. Okay, we've got that. But also employees may only submit one expense report every 30 days. So let's take a look at our data set. So you can see that we have our report date and we also have our previous report date. So using those two columns, we have exactly what we need to calculate whether it's been 30 days since the last report was submitted. So jumping back into Power Automate, you can see I've already got my condition for making sure that their expense is authorised there. And the way that this rule is described is that we need the person to both be authorised by HR and we need to make sure they've only submitted one expense report in the last 30 days. So I can add another row to this condition. And you see that when I add a row, this box appears up here that says and. So what this means is that I am going to look for row 1 to be true and row 2 to be true, and any rows I add before it. Equally, I can change this to or, and in that case, it is going to be true. It's going to go down the yes column if row 1 is true, or if row 2 is true. Even if row 1 is not true, then if row 2 is true, it's going to be a yes. But in this case, we want an and. And what are we actually looking for here? Well, we have the previous report date and we have the report date. So we want to make sure that the report date minus 30 days or the previous report date plus 30 days is not greater than the report date that we've got. So let's just build that up. And usefully, when we get data from Excel, the dates are conveyed as a number of days since the start of 1900. So we can use that to our advantage here, and we're going to use our previous report date. You can see that I've already composed this as a number by using the int function here. So I'm going to use the output of this compose function, and I'm going to come in and create an expression. The expression that I want to use is add, and then I'm going to come back to my dynamic content and I'm going to get the outputs of my previous report date as an int, as an integer. And then come along to the end of this, comma 30. So what this is going to do is add 30 days to that number that I've got there. So I want that to be less than or equal to my report date. So let's grab that. And I want to use the report date as an integer. There we go. So what I'm saying here is once I add 30 days to the previous report date. So the minimal that I want is that date plus 30 days is the date that I've submitted my report. So in that case, it will be equal to. In all other cases that are allowed, it will be less than, because if it's greater than, it means that there's been less than 30 days since the previous report date to the current date that we've submitted this report. And it's an and. So let's go ahead and save this and see what happens. So you can see I now have a few more people, or one more person in my no table, because there aren't 30 days here between these two dates. There are, in fact, 30 days between these two dates, but this person is not expenses authorised, so that's the reason they go into the no. And everyone else is still there. So next, let's make this slightly more complicated. So we're going to say employees can only submit their expense report once authorised by HR. Okay, we've got that. They can only submit an expense report once every 30 days, unless their job role is a manager. So managers are allowed to submit more than one expense report every 30 days. So jumping back into Power Automate, we can easily add that condition. We know that we have the role, and we can say equals to manager. But in this case, as this is set up right now, in order to go down the yes column, it needs to be authorized. So this expenses authorized needs to be equal to yes. We need the dates to be 30 days apart, and we need the person to be equal to a manager. We need them to be manager. That isn't quite what we want, because actually we've got two conditions here, and one of them is kind of a nested condition. So what we can do in Power Automate to take care of that is we use these little check boxes. Then we're going to come over here and we're going to say make group. And you see now what we've got is kind of a replication of what we had above, but we've got another little group with its own and here. So in this case, we need the first row and the two second rows, the second and third rows to be true. And both of these need to be true to equal a true, right? But that isn't what we want. We actually want it to be an or. So we're going to change this to an or. So in this case, the expenses need to be authorized for everyone. And then either the expense report needs to be 30 days since the previous one, or the person is a manager. So in this case, they can both be authorized and a manager, and their expense reports can be 10 days, 15 days, 20 days apart, and this will still go down the yes, because this or condition is going to report back as a yes, we're okay. The expenses authorized is going to report back as a yes, we're okay. We've got and the first condition and the second condition, and so in that case we're going to go down the yes route. So let's just take a look at what that looks like. Let's take a look. So we've got our table here with a number of people in it. And notice that previously we had two people in this table here. Now we just have Alex. Megan has moved back over here. So why has she moved back over here? Well, Megan didn't have 30 days between her expense reports, but she is a manager. So our condition has worked that we have this manager move back over to yes, because managers are allowed to make more than one report every 30 days. So let's add a little bit more to this. So we've still got our first two conditions, and now we're adding in expense claims must be less than $1,000 in value unless the requesting employee works in the finance or facilities department. So for all reports, we need them to be less than $1,000 in value unless they come from finance and facilities. So how are we going to deal with this? So first of all, we can add a row here, and we have our value as an integer. We need that to be less than 1,000. But then we have some exceptions. So we're going to add a row, and we're going to pick up department here, and we could say is equal to finance, and another department is equal to facilities. Now right now this isn't set up as we want it to, because this is applying an and to all of these. So what we want to do is select all these again, and we're going to group them, and we need this to be an or group, because either it's going to be less than 1,000, or if it's equal to finance or facilities, then we don't care whether it's 1,000 or not anymore. We just are going to allow that one through. So let's say or. And now in this case, we now have three different criteria in our initial and. We have the expenses authorized, we have the 30 days or more or a manager, and we have the $1,000 or one of these departments. And we need to get a positive, a yes, on each of these criteria, but only one of each of these sub-criteria. So let's go through and see how this works. So you can see our table over here is reduced a little bit, and we now have a couple of others in here, because let's take a look. We've got $1,000 value in the IT department. Well, that's not going to be allowed through. But we do have a $4,500 value in the facilities department, which is going to be allowed through. So you can see our conditions there have worked. Now let's move on to the last one. So we've got all of our conditions set up until now, as we have and are working, and now we're going to add another one. So once an expense claim has been submitted, if it's from the finance department, it must be approved by the CFO. If it's from the facilities department, it must be approved by the facilities manager and facilities director, or else it should be approved by the employee's direct supervisor. So jumping back into Power Automate, how can we deal with this? Because right below here, we have a yes or a no. We have two options that we can pursue. And so everything coming through this condition needs to either turn into a positive or a negative. It's a binary output. A condition is always going to give you a binary output, no matter how complicated your criteria are, no matter how many rows are here, the output is either going to be a yes or a no. But in this case, we have three different outputs. We've got one criteria if the department is finance, another criteria if the department is facilities, and a third criteria for everyone else. So how are we going to deal with this? So to start off with, let's come down here and we're going to append to this table an extra item. We're going to say approver. And this is just going to add this to our table, and for the sake of this right now, we're just going to say none. So we now have a column in our table, an entry into each row, which is the approver, which we're adding to the data set. This isn't in our initial data set here. But the way that we're going to do this is we're going to split this up. So once an expense claim has been submitted, so if it goes down the yes route, then that's the expense claim being submitted. So once it's been submitted, we need to do something else to it. So what are we going to do? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down to my control options here, and I'm going to use a different one. I'm going to use a switch. And what a switch allows us to do is to look at one simple criteria, one variable. So the variable that we're going to look at here is our department. And it allows us to build up a different set of actions depending on what that value is. So it provides a similar tool to condition in terms of it helps you to guide your automation, your flow as you want it to go. But it works in a very different way, because in this case, I'm going to evaluate what my input is. That input could be anything. In this case, it's coming from my Excel table, but I could build that up elsewhere and create a unique variable that comes into my switch. And then it's simply looking at what is the value that we're pushing into this switch to allow us to do different kinds of actions. So I'm going to come up to the top here and I'm just going to create an additional variable. So let's initialize a variable. And I'm going to initialize a new string. And this string is going to be called var approvers. No initial value. And I'm going to come back down into my apply to each, into my condition. And what I'm going to do is, in the case of this department being finance, I'm going to add an action, a variable action, which is to set a variable. I'm going to take this variable approvers and I'm going to say the value is CFO. And then I'm going to add another case. And in this case, I'm going to say facilities. And I'm going to come over here and do a set variable again. I'm going to set the same variable, so my it's var approvers, and I'm going to say facilities manager and facilities director. And then in every switch I have a default. So the default is going to be if it hasn't hit either of these criteria, then for everything else. So my default is going to be set variable again. And I'm going to pick my approvers variable, and I'm going to say direct supervisor. Now, obviously, in a working system, you're not just going to be hard coding these values into a variable. You're going to be doing something like using the Office 365 users connector in order to find out who that person is, and then adding that in dynamically into your process. But this is simply to show you how you can make that decision. So I've now got all of that in my yes strand. So what I need to do is come down to my my table that I'm creating. So what I'm going to do is grab this, and I'm going to put that underneath my switch. So I've just moved this around, so the switch comes first and my append row to table data comes second. And I'm just going to add in var approvers here. So you can see down here I've got HR direct supervisor, IT direct supervisor, finance CFO, facilities manager, and facilities director, finance CFO. So that has worked. Now, one of the things you need to be cognizant of is there is an issue with concurrency here, because we're setting a variable which we've established outside of our apply to each. And so if you were to have multiple concurrency in this apply to each, then you would run into problems with that variable. So just be aware of that here. So I hope that by watching this video, you've got some pointers on how you can take your business processes and the rules and policies that exist within your business and turn them into simple steps that you can apply in Power Automate to allow you to automate whatever the process is that you're looking at that has those rules applied to it. This skill is incredibly important because this is where tools like Power Automate ultimately add value to your business. You want to take what is existing and improve it with automation. You don't want to have to throw it out and start again just because you're using an automation product. I hope that this video has been useful to you and has added some value to the work that you're doing. If it has, then please give it a like. And if you like content like this, then please do consider subscribing to the channel. Until next time, bye-bye.